The prison yard was unusually quiet that afternoon. Sunlight streamed through the high walls, casting sharp shadows across the gravel and concrete. Inmates moved about, some playing basketball, others just lounging in groups, talking, smoking, or sizing each other up. Among them, one man walked calmly, almost unnoticed, Chuck Norris. Dressed in standard prison attire, sleeves rolled up, sneakers slightly scuffed, he looked like any other inmate. His eyes scanned the yard, cool and observant, while his hands remained relaxed at his sides. Some prisoners noticed him but immediately dismissed him as another quiet, older guy who kept to himself. They had no idea who they were looking at. In one corner, a group of rough-looking prisoners gathered, whispering and pointing toward Chuck. "That guy's new," one said. "Doesn't look like much, does he?" Another laughed. "Let's see how tough he really is." They didn't realize that they had just selected their first target, and the one person in the yard they should have avoided. Chuck continued walking toward the benches, ignoring the whispers. His calm presence seemed to draw attention without effort. Some inmates assumed he was weak. They saw no muscle bulging through his shirt, no flash of tattoos or scars. But those who knew martial arts, or had ever heard of him, would have understood the danger immediately. The group of prisoners began forming a casual circle around him, pretending it was coincidence, but every movement was calculated. One of them cracked a joke, loud enough for Chuck to hear. "Hey, old man, think you can handle yourself here?" The others snickered. They thought they were asserting dominance, testing the waters. Chuck stopped, looked at them briefly, his expression calm yet piercing. He said nothing. There was no anger, no tension, just a quiet confidence that made the group pause for a fraction of a second. That pause, barely noticeable, was the first warning they would get. Unbeknownst to them, the man they were about to target was not just an ordinary inmate. He was a legend, a trained fighter, and someone whose skill and discipline had been honed for decades. And in that moment, the prisoner's casual decision to challenge him set the stage for an encounter they would never forget. What happens next in the yard will shock everyone, including those who thought they were in control. The small circle of prisoners continued to whisper among themselves, eyes darting toward Chuck Norris. One of them, a tall, burly man with a jagged scar across his cheek, leaned closer and muttered, "He looks soft. Too quiet. Maybe he's scared." Another, a younger inmate with a sneer permanently etched on his face, laughed. "Quiet ones are the easiest to break." They didn't notice how calm Chuck remained, casually sitting on a nearby bench, watching them with a steady gaze. There was no tension in his shoulders, no unnecessary movements, only the kind of quiet patience that comes from decades of experience. To the prisoners, however, it looked like weakness, and weakness, in prison, is always tempting to test. The group began plotting. They whispered names and roles, each one trying to act confident while secretly feeling the thrill of an easy target. "We'll surround him," one said. "Cut him off if he tries to move." Another added, "Maybe a quick scare first, see if he's really as soft as he looks." A third prisoner, slightly older but equally reckless, grinned. "I heard he's new here. No connections. Nobody to back him up. Let's make this fun." Laughter followed, the kind that echoes off prison walls but masks a creeping sense of overconfidence. Chuck, meanwhile, didn't react. His eyes followed their movements, noting who stepped where, who shifted nervously, and who was trying too hard to appear dominant. He wasn't worried. He didn't need to act. His presence alone began to command attention, even if the prisoners didn't realize it yet. The group began to approach him slowly, pretending to pass by, keeping a casual air while subtly closing the circle. "We need to show him the rules," one whispered. Another chuckled. "Yeah, let's teach him how things work around here." They believed in the illusion of control. They thought fear was theirs to give. Other inmates started noticing the tension. Phones weren't allowed, but several made hand gestures, signaling each other that something was about to go down. Whispers spread. "Who's that guy? Why are they circling him?" Nobody expected what was coming. Chuck finally stood, stretching lightly as if just getting up for a stroll. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the growing nervous energy of the prisoners. They didn't know who they were dealing with, a mistake that would cost them dearly. Have you ever seen someone totally misjudged by others? Comment below which country or city you're watching this from. The first prisoner stepped closer, trying to look intimidating. "Hey, old man, think you can handle yourself here?" The words were casual but edged with menace. The others laughed, nodding and closing ranks, fully confident that Chuck would back down. Chuck tilted his head slightly, studying the group. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let a silence hang in the air, a silence heavy enough to make the circle pause. The prisoners shifted nervously, sensing something strange but unable to identify it. "We'll show him," the scarred man muttered under his breath, unaware that Chuck had already anticipated every move, every angle. The way Chuck held himself, relaxed yet alert, radiated control. Every prisoner's subconscious began to doubt, even if they didn't admit it aloud. As the circle tightened, Chuck calmly positioned himself, feet planted firmly, body relaxed. There was no fear in his stance, no aggression, just readiness. The prisoners continued their whispering, plotting, confident they were about to prove themselves. One of them made a motion to push Chuck, testing his reflexes. Chuck didn't flinch. The small movement was enough to send a ripple of hesitation through the group. They didn't know it yet, but the first real mistake had already been made. Chuck's eyes swept over the group one last time. Every twitch, every nervous glance, every fake show of bravado was catalogued. The prisoners thought they were preparing for dominance. Chuck was preparing for control. In the prison yard, appearances can be deceiving, and the ones who misjudge often regret it immediately. By now, a few inmates from a distance were quietly observing. Even they could feel the tension building. Something was about to happen, something no one expected. The prisoners had made their plan. They thought they were ready. They thought they had the advantage. But one thing they didn't account for was Chuck Norris, the man who didn't just fight, but anticipated, controlled, and executed every move with precision. And in that moment, the prison yard became a stage for a confrontation that would leave everyone stunned. The prison yard had grown noticeably quieter. Even the distant chatter from other inmates seemed to fade as the group closed in on Chuck Norris. The scarred leader stepped forward, a smirk on his face. "All right, old man," he said, his voice low but dripping with arrogance. "Let's see what you're made of." Chuck looked at him calmly, his posture relaxed. He didn't move or react aggressively, but there was an unmistakable aura around him, a quiet confidence that made the men hesitate for just a split second. That pause, barely perceptible, was enough to unsettle the group. One of the younger prisoners stepped closer, trying to poke fun. "You think you're some kind of tough guy? You look like you belong on the bench, not in a fight." He laughed nervously, trying to mask his own anxiety. The other prisoners nodded, closing the circle around Chuck. They believed their combined numbers gave them the upper hand. Chuck didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, scanning each man carefully, noting their stances, their tension, the way they were shifting their weight. Every subtle movement told him more than words ever could. To the prisoners, he was just standing there, silent, calm, seemingly unbothered. The first shoves began, small, testing his reflexes. One prisoner jabbed at Chuck's shoulder, expecting a reaction, but Chuck barely flinched. His eyes locked on the man, and in that gaze was a quiet warning. The kind of warning that makes you reconsider your next move, but the prisoners didn't notice it yet. The scarred leader growled, frustration creeping into his voice. "You're lucky you're old, or I'd." He was cut off by a subtle but unmistakable shift in Chuck's stance. It was almost imperceptible, but the leader felt it. He stopped mid-sentence, sensing something he couldn't explain. Chuck finally spoke, his voice calm but commanding. "Violence isn't the answer, unless you force it." The words were quiet, almost casual, but they carried weight. The prisoners paused, exchanging nervous glances. Something about the way he said it made the group realize they had underestimated him. Still, their arrogance kept them moving forward. One of the younger men lunged, trying to push Chuck off balance. In one smooth motion, Chuck stepped aside, redirecting the man's momentum so he stumbled forward harmlessly into the dirt. The yard seemed to hold its breath. The first clear sign that this man was no ordinary inmate. Another prisoner swung at him, fists flying, but Chuck's movements were precise, controlled, almost effortless. He deflected, blocked, and countered, not violently, but with enough force to make the attacker stumble back. The crowd of onlookers, a mix of inmates and guards, began murmuring. Phones were forbidden, but some were already signaling silently, capturing the scene with eyes and gestures. The tension rose sharply. Chuck's family-like calm only heightened the prisoners' confusion. They expected fear, resistance, or panic, and what they got instead was absolute control. Every motion, every step, every glance conveyed mastery and confidence. If you were standing in the prison yard right now, watching this unfold, what would you do? Type your answer in the comments below. The scarred leader tried to rally his men, shouting commands. Come on, surround him. Don't let him move. But Chuck was already anticipating their strategy. Each attempt to corner him was met with a subtle, almost invisible adjustment. The men were forced to stumble, misstep, and collide with one another. Their frustration grew, and so did the whispers among other inmates. Chuck's calmness was like a storm in disguise. The more the prisoners tried to intimidate him, the more they exposed themselves to his control. He didn't strike with anger. He didn't shout or roar. He simply existed in that space with authority, timing, and precision. Every lunge, every shove, every attempt to provoke him only highlighted their own lack of skill. One prisoner, finally realizing something was wrong, froze mid-step. Hey, he's not just an old man, he whispered to a companion. Something about him. I don't know what it is. The others ignored him at first, but doubt began to creep into their minds. Chuck's movements remained minimal, almost relaxed, but there was a dangerous edge to every reaction. His stance, his focus, his quiet power, it was enough to make even the boldest of men reconsider. And that hesitation, that tiny flicker of doubt, was the first crack in the prisoner's confidence. By the end of the confrontation, the prisoners realized that they had misjudged him completely. Chuck Norris wasn't just an inmate. He was a force, calm, precise, and utterly unshakable. And the yard, which had moments ago been buzzing with arrogance and mischief, now held a quiet, tense respect. The stage was set. The prisoners had targeted the wrong man. And the next moves, when they came, would only reveal just how ruthless and unstoppable Chuck Norris could be. The yard was silent now, a heavy tension hanging in the air. The prisoners who had tried to provoke Chuck Norris were nursing bruised egos and shallow scrapes, realizing they had seriously miscalculated. Their bravado was gone, replaced with unease. Chuck hadn't even raised his voice or lost his composure. He had simply neutralized their attempts with a calm, precise efficiency that left no doubt about who controlled the moment. As the group of would-be aggressors huddled together, whispering furiously, a young inmate who had been observing from the side suddenly gasped. His eyes widened in recognition. Wait, that's Chuck Norris, he whispered urgently to another. The martial arts legend, the one in all the movies. The man who takes down anyone. The words spread like wildfire. At first, it was a murmur, barely audible over the clatter of the yard, but soon every inmate within earshot was buzzing. Chuck Norris? Someone muttered. The one who's unstoppable. Another added, that's him? No way he's here. The prisoners who had just tried to dominate him froze. Their eyes flicked toward him nervously, their earlier confidence evaporating. They glanced at one another, now realizing the gravity of their mistake. The fear that had been dormant now surged, uncontainable. They had challenged a man whose reputation alone could instill terror. Chuck, meanwhile, remained unflustered. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't gloat, and he didn't take advantage of the whispers. Instead, he continued to walk slowly through the yard, his posture calm, measured, and alert. Each step carried authority, a subtle reminder that he was in control, even if no one had touched him. Some inmates tried to act casual, pretending they didn't hear the whispers, but their body language betrayed them. One of the scarred prisoners, the leader of the group that had confronted him, muttered under his breath, We messed up. That's Chuck Norris. Chuck paused near the water fountain, glancing briefly toward the group. He spoke softly, almost to himself, yet his words carried across the yard. Respect is earned, not assumed. And violence is never the first answer. Even in that quiet statement, there was weight, authority, experience, discipline. Bystanders, including other inmates and a few prison guards, began exchanging glances. Some of the younger guards, who had only heard legends of Chuck's skill, now watched in disbelief as the man moved with calm efficiency, handling an impossible situation without aggression. The whispers grew louder, spreading further across the yard. The prisoners' fear turned to disbelief. They had assumed a fight, a simple show of strength or intimidation. But instead, they had been tested and outmaneuvered without ever seeing a single overt strike. Chuck's reputation wasn't just rumor. It was real, living, and entirely present. The scarred leader clenched his fists, trying to regain composure. We didn't know, he stammered. He glanced at the others, but they avoided his gaze. They had underestimated him. They had misjudged a man whose discipline and skill far surpassed their assumptions. Chuck's calm, deliberate presence had done more than defend him. It had shattered their confidence and reminded everyone in the yard that appearances could be deceiving. A man who seemed ordinary, even vulnerable, could possess unparalleled skill and control. Have you ever underestimated someone based on how they looked? Comment below what you would have done in this situation. Even the guards who had been watching closely couldn't hide their surprise. They had assumed a minor confrontation, something routine, but Chuck had turned it into a demonstration of control, precision, and authority without escalating violence. The prisoners began whispering among themselves, not daring to challenge him again. Some even backed away subtly, giving him space. Chuck didn't move aggressively. He simply existed in that space with quiet dominance, allowing his reputation to do the work that intimidation normally would. By the end of this tense moment, the prison yard had shifted. The initial arrogance of the prisoners had been replaced with caution, fear, and a grudging respect. Chuck Norris had not only defended himself, he had reminded everyone present why he was legendary, why his reputation was well-earned, and why misjudging him was a grave error. The stage was now set for the next act, the full confrontation that would leave everyone, prisoners and guards alike, in awe of his ruthless skill and unshakable discipline. But before that happened, one fact was clear: underestimating Chuck Norris in a prison yard was a mistake that no one would forget. The yard was charged with tension. The prisoners who had attempted to provoke Chuck Norris now circled him cautiously, their earlier arrogance replaced by unease. Every subtle movement from Chuck seemed deliberate, precise, and calm, yet every step carried the weight of a man who had mastered control over body and mind. The whispers had spread across the entire prison yard. That's Chuck Norris, the legend, the unstoppable fighter. But even knowing his name, some prisoners were too proud, too reckless to back down. The scarred leader stepped forward, trying to mask his fear with bravado. "All right, old man, let's see what you've got. Don't think your reputation will save you." Chuck didn't react with words. He simply shifted his weight slightly, centering himself. His calm stance communicated far more than the prisoner's reckless shouting ever could. "I am ready, but I am not reckless. One wrong move, and you'll regret it." The first strike came almost immediately. A younger prisoner lunged at Chuck with a clumsy swing. In a fluid, almost imperceptible motion, Chuck sidestepped, grabbing the attacker's arm and using his momentum to throw him harmlessly to the ground. The prisoner hit the dirt with a grunt, scrambling to his feet, but the subtle authority in Chuck's eyes kept him frozen in caution. The scarred leader barked orders, trying to rally the group. "Go, all of you. Surround him." But Chuck had already anticipated every angle. With each prisoner who approached, Chuck countered with minimal, precise motions, a sweep to unbalance, a redirection of momentum, a firm push that sent them stumbling without serious harm. He moved like water, effortless, flowing, unstoppable. The yard erupted in murmurs. Other inmates whispered, "Did you see that? He didn't even hit him hard, and still took him down." Guards exchanged uneasy glances, realizing this was no ordinary inmate. They were witnessing a master at work. One prisoner, desperate to regain control, charged with full force. Chuck didn't flinch. With a subtle twist and a single, controlled strike, the man was neutralized, his momentum turned against him. He crashed into the gravel with a thud, groaning but unharmed. The remaining prisoners hesitated, their confidence collapsing. Could you face someone like Chuck Norris? Type yes or no in the comments below. Chuck's movements were precise, calculated, and disciplined. He didn't need to strike with rage or violence. The skill and control alone were enough to dominate. Every shove, every grab, every attempt at intimidation was met with a counter that left the attackers unbalanced, confused, and increasingly fearful. The scarred leader, now realizing the depth of his mistake, stumbled backward. I can't believe this," he muttered under his breath. He's not just strong, his His words trailed off as Chuck calmly adjusted his stance, silent yet commanding. The entire yard seemed to hold its breath. Chuck didn't need to fight with brute force. Each movement was a demonstration of mastery. The prisoners, once so sure of themselves, now found themselves reacting to Chuck rather than controlling the situation. One by one, their attacks were deflected or redirected, leaving them stunned, disoriented, and powerless. Even the observing inmates and guards were mesmerized. The quiet confidence, the ruthless precision, and the sheer control made it clear. Chuck Norris was untouchable. The legend was not just rumor. It was reality, unfolding before their eyes. Finally, the scarred leader dropped his stance, his hands raised in reluctant surrender. Chuck's calm gaze met his, conveying a single unspoken message: respect is earned. Challenge wisely. By the end of the confrontation, the prisoners were either retreating or standing frozen, overwhelmed by the demonstration of skill. Chuck had shown them that fighting wasn't about anger or aggression. It was about control, precision, and intelligence. Every move was measured, every response calculated, and every attacker humbled without unnecessary violence. The yard, once a place of casual arrogance and intimidation, had been transformed. Chuck Norris had turned the tables completely. The prisoners had underestimated him, and in doing so, they had learned the hard way why his reputation was legendary. The stage was now set for the final reveal and the aftermath, where even the rest of the prison and guards would recognize the sheer dominance of Chuck Norris. The prison yard had fallen into an uneasy silence. Chuck Norris stood calmly in the center, his posture unshaken, his expression unreadable. The prisoners who had tried to provoke him were either nursing minor bruises or frozen in disbelief, their earlier arrogance completely shattered. They had underestimated him, and now the consequences of their mistake were becoming painfully clear. Even as Chuck remained quiet, whispers began to ripple through the yard. One of the younger inmates, still trying to process what had just happened, muttered, "Wait, that guy, that's Chuck Norris, isn't it? The Chuck Norris." At first, the words were met with disbelief. The scarred leader squinted, trying to convince himself it was just a rumor. "No, can't be," he whispered, shaking his head. He's just an inmate like the rest of us." But the whispers spread quickly. Inmates from nearby cells and corners of the yard began repeating the name in hushed tones. Chuck Norris, the legend, the martial arts master, the man who can't be beaten. The tension shifted palpably. Fear replaced arrogance. Respect replaced hostility. Even the guards, who had been watching the chaos unfold, exchanged astonished glances. A senior officer, one who had heard stories but never believed them fully, stepped forward and addressed the yard. "Everyone calm down. That's right, that is Chuck Norris." The prisoners froze. The scarred leader's jaw tightened. "No, it can't be," he muttered again, glancing at Chuck with a mixture of fear and awe. The realization sank in slowly. The man they had mocked, the man they had planned to intimidate, was not just any inmate. He was a legend, a master fighter, and someone whose reputation was entirely justified. Chuck, as always, remained humble. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gloat or make threats. He simply looked around the yard, his calm gaze resting on each prisoner. His silence spoke louder than words, conveying authority and mastery. In that moment, the prisoners understood something crucial. Fighting isn't just about strength or aggression. It's about control, discipline, and precision. The scarred leader finally lowered his gaze, his body language betraying a newfound respect. One of the younger prisoners, trembling slightly, whispered, We should never have tried that." Chuck stepped forward slowly, his presence commanding without being aggressive. "No one should be judged by appearances," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Respect is earned, and it is given freely only when deserved." The yard remained quiet, hanging on his words. The prisoners, though still nervous, began to recognize the lesson they had just received. It wasn't fear alone that Chuck commanded. It was his integrity, discipline, and the undeniable skill that backed it up. Some of the observing inmates nodded subtly, acknowledging his superiority without words. Even the guards looked on with respect. Chuck's message was clear. Power is meaningless without control, and aggression without wisdom leads only to failure. How would you react if someone disrespected you like that? Comment below with your response. The scarred leader finally stepped forward cautiously, offering a nod of acknowledgement. You are unlike anyone I've ever faced," he said quietly. The other prisoners followed suit, some lowering their heads, some backing away, all understanding that they had challenged the wrong man. Chuck didn't celebrate or gloat. He simply allowed the moment to pass, demonstrating that true strength lies not in humiliating others, but in standing firm with dignity. The yard, once filled with tension and arrogance, now felt an almost reverent atmosphere. Chuck's calm dominance had turned a potentially violent confrontation into a lesson in humility and respect. Even distant inmates, who had only been watching from the corners of the yard, began sharing the story quietly, spreading the tale of what had just occurred. The legend of Chuck Norris was no longer just rumor. It had been proven in the most vivid way possible. By the end of the encounter, the prisoners had learned their lesson. Respect had been earned, fear had been replaced by awe, and Chuck Norris had once again demonstrated why his reputation as a ruthless fighter and disciplined master was legendary. The prison yard had witnessed not just a fight, but a demonstration of unparalleled skill and unshakable character. By the time the yard had quieted, word of what had just unfolded had already begun to spread. Prisoners recounted the events to each other, emphasizing not only Chuck Norris' unparalleled skill, but also his calm demeanor, his discipline, and the respect he demanded without ever raising his voice. Phones weren't allowed in most areas of the prison, but whispers traveled fast, and those who managed to capture glimpses of the confrontation began sharing them outside. Within hours, the story went viral. Short clips and dramatic retellings appeared on social media platforms worldwide. Comments poured in from every corner of the globe: New York, London, Manila, Sydney, Rio de Janeiro. People marveled not just at Chuck's fighting ability, but at the way he handled himself with dignity and restraint. He didn't just fight, he taught a lesson, one viewer wrote. Another commented, "This is the definition of calm strength." Even outside the prison, law enforcement, journalists, and fans were stunned. Analysts debated and replayed the confrontation, highlighting Chuck's mastery of movement, his anticipatory reflexes, and his ability to control a volatile situation without unnecessary violence. The lesson was clear. True power isn't about brute force. It's about discipline, presence, and moral authority. Back in the yard, the prisoners who had challenged him were forever changed. The scarred leader, once arrogant and dismissive, now moved with caution and respect whenever Chuck was near. Others followed suit, understanding that appearances can be deceiving and that underestimating someone can have serious consequences. They had faced not only a man but a living legend, and the memory of it would remain with them for years. Chuck, as always, remained humble. He didn't boast or demand recognition. He simply returned to his routine, walking with quiet confidence, demonstrating through every step that strength and respect are inseparable. For him, the real victory wasn't in showing off his skill. It was in teaching an invaluable lesson without losing his composure. If you believe no one should be judged by appearance, type respect in the comments and share this story with someone who needs to see it. The clips and retellings sparked a wave of admiration. Social media influencers, sports enthusiasts, martial artists, and ordinary viewers shared their reactions. Memes, short videos, and threads celebrating Chuck's humility and precision went viral. The hashtag Chuck Norris Respect trended globally, as millions praised not only his fighting ability, but the way he handled the confrontation with calm authority. In the prison, the ripple effect of the event was immediate. Guards acknowledged Chuck's reputation with new respect, and the prisoners adjusted their behavior accordingly. Tension was replaced by a newfound order, one defined by respect, humility, and recognition of true skill. The lesson had been delivered without unnecessary violence or humiliation, leaving everyone involved better for it. The story resonated far beyond the prison walls. Interviews, articles, and online discussions debated Chuck's techniques, his philosophy, and the principle behind his actions. Everyone agreed on one thing. This wasn't just a fight. It was a lesson in integrity, control, and respect. By the end of the week, the viral story had reached millions. Viewers praised Chuck Norris not only for being a legendary fighter, but for demonstrating that true power lies in discipline, self-control, and the ability to act with purpose. The prisoners, the guards, and the online audience all learned the same lesson. Underestimate a man like Chuck Norris at your own peril, but also recognize that real strength is always tempered with respect. The legend had grown, and so had the respect for the man behind it. Chuck Norris remained the same, humble, disciplined, and fearless, proving once again that true greatness is not just measured by what you can do, but by how you handle power and inspire others.